Election 70. CBS News coverage of the congressional and gubernatorial races across the country. Sponsored by Holiday Inn, the nation's innkeeper. The Bulova Watch Company, makers of Accutron, Bulova, and Caravel watches. Nestle's of White Plains, New York. And by the Savings and Loan Foundation, on behalf of your nearby Savings and Loan Association. Reporting from the CBS News election headquarters, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Well, Americans went to the polls today in another exercise of the democratic process, and it seems that they turned out in numbers heavier than had been expected, despite some rather poor weather in many sections of the country. It was the first test at the polls of the Nixon-Agnew administration, and while in such off-year elections many local issues affect the balloting, of course, the results as they are collected here tonight should give us some clues as to the mood of this nation of ours. Is it becoming more conservative politically, for instance? Does it believe, as President Nixon and Vice President Agnew suggested in their campaign speeches, that the Republican candidates can do more to restore law and order, to redress campus and judicial permissiveness? There seems little chance that the actual control of Congress will pass to the Republicans. Although the administration early in the campaign at least had hoped to win control of the Senate, they would need to hold on to all of the 10 seats that they have up tonight and win 7 of the 25 Democratic seats at stake in order to do that. Most recent polls indicate that the Republicans have virtually no chance of taking control of the Senate tonight. In the House, they would need 30 seats to tilt the balance in their favor, and they're conceded virtually no chance of doing that either. On the other hand, any gain for the Republicans in either house, any gain for them, while not sufficient to give President Nixon the majority he wants, would be a reversal of the usual, the traditional off-year trend, and would be taken as an indication of a vote of confidence in the administration and its policies. The Democrats would have to pick up a seat or 2 in the Senate, and perhaps as many as 20 in the House, before the analysts would suggest that they had handed the Nixon administration a clear-cut defeat. President Nixon has put his prestige on the line tonight. He's campaigned for his candidates harder than any president in an off year. He's made support of his administration and his programs a major issue. He's urged numerous Republicans in safe congressional seats to strike out for the Senate. His hand is very heavy in this race indeed. But such is the record of off-year campaigns, and you remember that neither Presidents Johnson nor Kennedy did very well in '62 and '66, that just breaking even will be a Republican victory. Of course, Congress is not the only seat of government at stake today. We should note there are the state houses, the county offices, the city halls, and so on and so on. A lot of referenda on the ballot. At the state capitals, 35 governorships and 45 legislatures are going to be decided, and they too are important to this nation as a whole. With me at our CBS News election headquarters for these reports tonight, Mike Wallace will be reporting from his area, that's the east. Roger Mudd's going to be reporting from the south. Dan Rather from the Midwest. Bill Stout from the west. David Shoemaker is going to concentrate on those congressional results. And seated across from me to provide his own special analysis, as always, my colleague Eric Severai. Eric?
Well, Walter, this election has been an exercise in the politics of polarization. It has reflected the divisions in the country. It has played upon them. It has made them worse. And maybe the overall results tonight will show us just how badly we are divided and just where the lines of division run. A poor gift maybe, but something to start from to build for a better future if we've got men around big enough to do that. Tonight may show us how far we have drifted to the right after a generation of generally liberal politics. The Republican Party is trying to expand its permanent base rightward toward the Wallace vote in the South and the historically Democratic vote among northern big city workers who are resentful of disorder and of the movement of non-white populations. The President has asked that this congressional election be regarded as a referendum on his stewardship, even though he has not campaigned on his own positive achievements, at least not very much. By tomorrow, he should have a clearer idea of how politically safe his Vietnam withdrawal schedule really is, what realistic dangers may lie in his slow approach to controlling inflation and in the rise of unemployment. All this will affect his future decisions and policies, and therefore affect the general condition of all of us. Walter?
Also here to assist us tonight is one of America's most distinguished political analysts, a very good dear friend, Theodore H. White, celebrated author of books on the last 3 presidential campaigns, title of which, and I do not doubt, will be mentioned at some course in the nature of this evening. Hello, Teddy. Welcome again.
Hello, Walter. I think we should be looking for movement tonight, one way or the other. Will the political deadlock that's held us paralyzed since 1966 be broken? Some of these midterm elections are tidal waves, like the 1958 upheaval, while others are simply wind ripples across the field, changing nothing. So, tidal wave or wind ripple, that's what we should be watching for. I think we start watching here in the Northeast, with the Buckley race in New York and the Dodd insurgency in Connecticut. How well can they do? Historically, can the conservatives really establish a major beachhead in the liberal Northeast? And again, we follow the map to the Midwest with the sister states of Ohio and Indiana, clear-cut clashes between liberals and conservatives, Taft versus Metzenbaum, Rauderbusch versus Hotke. Then to the South to see how the president's Southern strategy is working. Tennessee, Gore versus Brock, and Texas, Bush versus Benson. And then finally, West Coast, with the Murphy-Tunney toss-up in California and the faintest chance of an upset in New Mexico. I've been listening to Eric on the issues, and I have one last thought. The 2 parties have sold the issues in this campaign like the famous cigarette commercial. Which do you want, safe jobs or safe streets? Just how each state absorbs that message depends on the chemistry of 1,000 communities and 100 candidates. And I'm not sure we might not be a lot better off with a tidal wave than a wind ripple which will leave us just where we are now.
And yet it does look in the polls and the early testing before the people actually went to cast their ballots today that it might just end up being that as we are now about.
That's the way it feels at this moment. Let's wait for 5 hours.
All right. And already returns are beginning to come in from the first state with anything meaningful, and that's Tennessee. Roger Mudd can tell us what's happening there.
Walter, we've got about 15% of the popular vote in, and the margin remains about the same, relatively. William Brock, the Republican congressman from Chattanooga, heir to a candy fortune there, running against Albert Gore, going for his 4th term. Mr. Gore's scalp is one of the 5 most wanted scalps by the White House. All polls indicated he was in trouble, and tonight he appears to be in trouble. The popular vote indicates that he's running respectably in East Tennessee, which is where most of these returns are from. East Tennessee is a strong Republican area and has been so almost since statehood. But our CBS News vote profile analysis indicates that he has fallen behind in what should have been a strong section, which is Middle Tennessee, his own home grounds. We'll be watching this one closely in the next hour, and it ought to be over in an hour at least for purposes of the prediction.
You can bet, Roger, that they're watching it very carefully at Gore and Brock headquarters in Tennessee, too, and those are 2 of the places where we have our remote cameras tonight. Our CBS News cameras are watching the headquarters in the key states and key races, and this is the scene at those locations at this hour.
2 minutes and 1
As you can
point.
see, they're not too crowded right yet, but they certainly will be as the minutes begin to tick away toward a real decision in that critical race in Tennessee. CBS News election coverage will resume in a moment.
Introducing the Fuller Taster's Choice, the new freeze-dried coffee. Taster's Choice, the freeze-dried coffee that looks, sounds, smells like real percolator coffee, except you make it instantly.
You could have fooled me. Tastes like fresh perk coffee.
Taster's Choice from Nestle, the freeze-dried coffee. Good enough to fool you.
Oh, announcer, when do I play my solo?
Mr. Benny, when I say every payday put 5% of your paycheck in a savings and loan, that's your cue.
All right, I'll sit here and wait. Now, I won't be able to play my violin.
What a shame.
Jack Benny is brought to you by your nearby Savings and Loan Association.
I am?
Permit us to remind you again tonight as we follow these election returns together just what the figures are you are going to be watching. There are two sets of figures. First, those we call the tabulated vote, or raw vote sometimes, compiled by the News Election Service. That's the television networks and the major news services and newspapers. Those are the figures you see up on the large boards around us that will be shown as we tell you the tabulated vote, the actual vote counted at the polls. And also we have the vote profile analysis, CBS News' own vote profile analysis. This is gathered from a series of selected precincts around those critical states where we are keeping tabs of these major races. These precincts, we have learned through pre-polling, can give us an accurate indication of how the state as a whole will go. That's our vote profile analysis on which we will estimate winners and leading candidates in major races across the nation. We have some early returns from Indiana now, and Dan Rather has that report. Dan?
Well, Walter, we have what the writers on the sports pages might call a barn burner underway in Indiana. That is a very close and exciting race there. First, let's go to the actual votes tabulated. The 4% you see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen is 4% of the actual vote counted and tabulated. It shows Richard Rauterbush, the Republican conservative congressman who is trying to unseat Liberal Democratic Senator Vance Hartke, off to an early lead. This, keep in mind, is with only 4% of the vote actually in and tabulated. The exciting thing about the Indiana race thus far is that some of our vote profile analysis precincts are in, not nearly enough to get any trend as yet, but the ones that are in show this race 50-50 right down the middle. That's the way the polls showed the race to be, and that Indiana race continues to shape up to be one that may keep us here to the wee hours of the morning. It's the closest thing there is in the Midwest to a referendum on the Nixon administration. Rauterbush, a very strong pro-Nixon supporter, handpicked by the president for this job. Vance Hartke, a liberal, and his is also one of the 5 most wanted scalps at the White House. Let's take a look at the Illinois Senate race. We don't have any numbers up in Illinois as yet. The polls just now closing there. Again, on the basis of some vote profile analysis work we've been doing, far too early to discern any trend in that Illinois Senate race. Adlai Stevenson III trying to unseat the Republican incumbent, Ralph Tyler Smith, appointed to the seat of the late Senator Everett Dirksen. But on the basis of some very scattered precinct profiling that we've done, there are indications that Adlai Stevenson is running a little ahead in the suburbs where he was. That's where the race was to be decided. Smith's people felt all along they trailed Stevenson, but if they could make some inroads in the suburbs, they might beat him. Too early to say, but just mark it that Stevenson is off to a good start in the suburbs around Chicago. In the Ohio senatorial race, no numbers of any significance there yet. With less than 1% of the vote counted, you see in this rate Howard Metzenbaum, the Democrat, leading Robert Taft. That's mostly on the basis of the gubernatorial race in Ohio. If we can flip over to the Ohio governor's race on the board, please. John Gilligan, a heavy favorite here, the Democrat, over Roger Cloud, whose campaign was scandal-tinted, perhaps unjustifiably so, but nonetheless so. And Metzenbaum's chances depend heavily on Gilligan. Gilligan is off to an early lead with less than 1% of the vote counted. Walter, Indiana, for the moment, is the name of the game in the Midwest, however. That's our best race.
We're going to be watching in those gubernatorial races tonight several key states. As you know, they're in the state houses. There are 35 governorships up tonight, and most polls have listed 9 of those races as real toss-ups. 3 of them Democratic incumbent seats and 6 Republican seats. The ones we'll be watching particularly closely in those toss-up categories are in Connecticut and Kansas, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Wisconsin. The Democratic ones are in Connecticut, Kansas, and Maine. The Republicans in Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Wisconsin. And now perhaps Roger Mudd's got more on that Tennessee race for us. Roger?
Walter, we've got approaching 20% of the popular vote is in Tennessee in the senatorial race. And these returns are, as we said before, basically from East Tennessee. They're beginning to move now toward Nashville. But you must remember that in order to win tonight, Albert Gore needs about 2/3 of the George Wallace vote that was cast in 1968. Most of that vote came from the western part of the state, and we haven't heard from the west. That's Memphis and the rural areas along the Mississippi Delta. In the Tennessee gubernatorial race, Winfield Dunn from Memphis, running ahead of John J. Hooker, the Democrat from Nashville, the third party man, Douglas Heinsohn, fallen way off the pace. Dunn and Brock, incidentally, are matching each other almost vote for vote. Some other races we'll be looking at in the evening ahead include the Florida Senate race. There, William Kramer, the Republican from St. Petersburg, running against State Senator Lawton Childs of Lakeland. A few early returns in don't indicate much there. Also, we'll keep an eye on the Florida gubernatorial race. Governor Claude Kirk going for his second full term against State Senator Reuben Askew, the Democrat from Pensacola. And finally, the Georgia gubernatorial race, where Hal Suit, a former TV newscaster from Atlanta, Republican, running against Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, a peanut farmer from South Georgia. Returns there don't reveal much, but they will in another hour or so.
Many parts of the country, the polls are still open, of course, even though we're giving some scattered returns now. So, of course, if you still wish to vote, there's time many places around the country. You shouldn't be misled by the fact that we already may be declaring in the early stages of this evening, while polls are still open in some parts of your state, declaring certain winners in your states, determined on the basis of those sample precincts, our vote profile analysis I was telling you about a moment ago. Here at election headquarters for CBS News, we're naturally focusing on the major races for Congress and governor, but there are many other questions to be decided in tonight's election. We told you voters in 45 states are electing members of state legislatures. 43 states voters are asked to decide on various amendments and referenda. In many cities, most cities and towns, local candidates are up. And they're just as important to the scheme of things in those areas as the more glamorous figures get all the national attention. Their fate tonight can well depend on the people who get out and vote. It will depend on that. So you should be reminded that in many states like Tennessee and New Hampshire and Florida and North and South Dakota, the polls close at different times depending on location. For example, in Tennessee, some polls closed as early as 4 o'clock this afternoon, while others are going to be open until 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Don't be misled that all of the races have been decided because we are able to say how a race may come out with some polls still left open. As we move westward across the country, later and later closing times, of course, till we get way out there in Alaska, and it'll be 2 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time before all the Alaska polls close. So if you haven't done so, you still have a chance to vote in many areas, and you ought to exercise that democratic privilege. I look ahead now at what we can expect in a very short order now from the eastern states. Mike Wallace is the one who can tell us. Mike?
If you're up in Vermont, you can't vote anymore. The polls have closed only in Vermont in the East, Walter, and there are no meaningful returns in from Vermont as yet. The focus of attention here in the East, as we've been saying all along, is mostly on that Senate race in New York. The polls are still open here in New York. They will be for another hour and 40 minutes. And from all reports, the voter turnout throughout this state today was very heavy. The Nixon administration put a good deal into this one. They want to purge Charles Goodell, the Republican incumbent, from the Senate. They want to replace him with James Buckley, the brother of columnist William F. Buckley, a conservative. Put him in there in Goodell's place. The third man in the race is Richard Ottinger, a Democratic congressman from Westchester. In Maine and Massachusetts, in the East, attention is bound to go to two senatorial races, one in Maine, one in Massachusetts, Edmund Muskie up there and Edward Kennedy down in Massachusetts, for the reason that people will be watching to see just what kind of a majority Muskie and Kennedy will be able to turn up. The polls in both states remain open for another 45 minutes. They'll be looking at those totals for Muskie and Kennedy, obviously, to see if that's going to burnish their possible presidential image for 1972. Two very interesting races in Connecticut where the polls close in about 40 minutes. Incumbent Senator Thomas Dodd was censured by his colleagues in the Senate back in 1967 for diverting to his own use campaign funds raised at testimonial dinners and what all. Senator Dodd had a heart attack after that. He did not enter the Democratic primary. It was thought that he wasn't going to enter the race at all. He finally did, as an independent. He has two opponents. Democratic candidate is the Reverend Joseph Duffy, an Irish Protestant clergyman in a almost half Catholic state. 45% of Connecticut's voters are Catholic, and there is some opposition to him on that score. Also, the Democrats ordinarily have had themselves an Irish Catholic candidate, either as senator or governor. This time they don't. Joe Duffy, the Reverend Joseph Duffy, is the man who called Spiro Agnew a cowardly liar during the course of the campaign, after Agnew had said some nasty things about him. The Republican candidate is Lowell Weicker. He was thought by some Connecticut people, some Connecticut Republicans, to be too liberal, but Spiro Agnew and the President of the United States both came in to give him their seal of approval. That's going to be a fascinating race. It's one we'll be watching for a long time, I would imagine, before we have a winner. Walter?
No, there's an interesting House race, too. While you're concentrating on the Senate and the governors, we're going to be hearing from David Shoemaker on congressional makeup, but Adam Clayton Powell is not on the ballot in New York City for the first time in a very long time, although there are 34 black congressional candidates across the nation, more than we've ever had, I believe, this year. Adam Powell was defeated in the primary and is not on the ballot for the first time in 24 years.
He came out today, Walter, or yesterday, I believe, for the Liberal candidate, not for the Democratic candidate, Charlie Rangel, which was a little bit of a surprise to some people here in New York.
In a moment, more on the results of the 1970 election.
Every 3 days, a brand new Holiday Inn opens up.
Oh, good morning, girls. You look fine. Ready for a big day? Big opening, huh? Oh, that's there. Okay. Don't forget, check the television every morning to make sure it's working. And above all, courtesy, promptness, and a big smile.
And when it does, you can be sure that we're ready to serve you.
Please? Fine. Everybody ready now? Left, face. Forward, heart. For who you represent, that uniform stands for something. Dress it up now. Come on. This is the biggest day of our lives. And now for that moment we've all been expecting and waiting for patiently, the unveiling.
More than 1,200 Holiday Inns have opened up all around the world. And everyone does more to make you welcome. Because our sign stands for a warm welcome. Or it doesn't stand at all.
And so the returns are beginning to come in to our CBS News election headquarters here. We're going to be watching a fascinating midterm election, one in which the President of the United States has put his prestige at stake and his administration policies before the voters. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News election headquarters. We'll be back shortly.
This is CBS. Can you hear me? Election 70, CBS News coverage of the congressional and gubernatorial races across the country. Reporting from the CBS News election headquarters, correspondent Walter Cronkite. Are you... Excuse me. Vern? Vern? Are you going to cue me to introduce Walter, or do I just do the whole thing with a bit of a pause? Okay, okay. Election 70, CBS News coverage of the congressional and gubernatorial races across the country. Reporting from the CBS News election headquarters, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
And we have two indications from our CBS News vote profile analysis of winners in gubernatorial races. In Florida, the Democratic challenger Ruben Askew, according to our CBS News estimate, has won the governorship of that state, defeating incumbent Republican Governor Claude Kirk. With 25 out of our 70 selected precincts reporting, we've made this call. We believe that when all the votes are counted, Askew will have about 56% of the vote to 44 for Kirk. This was just about as had been predicted by the pollsters. In Alabama, as expected, George Wallace has had no difficulty winning the governorship of that state and building a political base again for a possible run in 1972. The senatorial races are as close as had been predicted. In Indiana, the Democratic incumbent Hartke is running behind the Republican Raudebush in very scattered early returns. Similarly scattered in early returns from Ohio has Republican Taft running behind Democrat challenger Metzenbaum. And in Tennessee, one of the prime target states for President Nixon and Vice President Agnew's campaign, the Democratic incumbent Senator Albert Gore is running behind the Republican challenger William Brock. Nelson Benton is at Gore headquarters in the main ballroom of the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee. Come in, Nelson.
Walter, it is still an hour before the polls close in western Tennessee, the most densely populated area of the state and an area in which Senator Gore hopes to have lots of strength. His aides, the few that are around right now, have neither run up the victory flag nor are they striking their colors. They say that they hope to come out of traditionally Republican Tennessee with at least 40% of the vote. They hope the farther west you go, the stronger the totals will get. But right now, they don't know the totals, and neither do we. Walter?
Those returns that we gave you a little moment ago are quite early. And now a CBS News estimate on the Florida senatorial race. Democrat Lawton Chiles, according to our CBS News estimate, has won the race for Senate from Florida, defeating Republican William Kramer. And we believe that when all the votes are counted, it should read about like that. 55% for Chiles, 45% for Kramer. This was based on about a third of our selected precincts and with only scattered returns in on the actual tabulated vote. That is the first of the senatorial races to be decided. That is the race in which the seat at stake was that of longtime Democratic Senator Spessard Holland, who retired this year. The White House was glad to have Republican William Kramer, a strong Nixon supporter, make the race on the, for that Senate seat, and had high hopes at one time, right up until the last few weeks, that Kramer would win a Senate seat for the administration in Florida. It now turns out that that is not to be. David Dick is at the William Brock headquarters in Tennessee, and he can tell us the mood there in these early hours.
When I talked to him earlier today at his home in Chattanooga, Congressman Brock was hoping for 60% of the traditionally Republican vote of eastern Tennessee. He was counting on a minimum of 40% of the traditionally Democratic vote in central Tennessee, and he was hoping that there'd be enough conservative Democrats voting for him in western Tennessee that put together would give him a margin of victory of 100,000 votes. Not everybody connected with the campaign is that optimistic, but most are confident that there will be victory for Brock tonight. David Dick at Brock headquarters in Nashville. Now back to you, Walter.
Roger Mudd, does that return from Florida? I'm sure it doesn't surprise you any.
Everything surprises me down south, Walter. I guess there was general agreement that Florida was not the sweet plum for picking that the GOP thought it was. There are 4 or 5 reasons. Particularly with the defeat of Claude Kirk. He was elected 4 years ago, if you remember, against Robert King High, the mayor of Miami. At that time, Mr. Kirk successfully hung a liberal label on Mayor High, and in Florida you can't do that and get elected very easily. 2 years later, Ed Gurney hung the liberal label on Leroy Collins and defeated him. In addition to that, Claude Kirk is not what you could honestly call a unifying force in the Republican Party. And the third reason is that Governor Kirk's opponent is Reuben Askew, who is from Pensacola, which is in the Panhandle. This will be the first governor in 100 years that Florida has had to come from the Panhandle. There was so much, in the Panhandle they feel cut off from the rest of the state. So there was a great deal of local pride. In addition, the entrance of Harold Carswell into the senatorial primary against William Kramer at Governor Kirk's urging further aggravated the feud between Kirk and Kramer. They could never get back together. There were several attempts to get them back together, but it didn't succeed, and the whole thing just broke apart down in Florida. So one of Mr. Nixon's hand-picked candidates, Mr. Kramer, just didn't make it tonight.
And one of the states in which he had campaigned quite actively. He made 3 stops in Florida, 4 stops in Florida. Right. So we'll just have to wait. Now that leaves Texas as another good toss-up state, and it still leaves Tennessee. Honestly, it's you can't count Albert Gore out, far from it. But I was surprised how early the Florida race could be decided. Just looking at our VPA statistics, Mr. Askew, Senator Askew, running 22% ahead of Robert King High's race 4 years ago in the moderate Republican precincts, revealing how fed up moderate Republicans are or were with Claude Kirk. Do you suppose soon-to-be former Governor Kirk has a political future? He was angling for that vice presidential nomination pretty hard back in '68.
Well, he was angling for it in order as part and parcel of an attempt to grab control of the Republican Party in Florida away from William Kramer, who was Mr. Nixon's #1 man in Florida. That's the basis of the whole Kirk-Kramer quarrel, is who's going to control the party. Bill Kramer from St. Petersburg almost single-handedly founded the GOP back in '52 and '54. He's been in the Congress since then, representing Pinellas County, and he's Mr. Republican. Kirk comes in and actually was elected on a fluke and tries in the interim to take it away from him, and now the party has got a big rebuilding job.
We'll be returning in a moment with more CBS News election coverage.
My name is David Humphreys. During my polar exploration in '68, I discovered that the map of Greenland was wrong, 3,000 square miles wrong. I suspect that my predecessors, including Admiral Peary, were led astray by their watches. You see, an error of only 4 seconds can throw you off a mile. My advantage was that I had an Accutron watch. You might say that this is the face that changed the map of Greenland.
The watch that's become a scientific instrument. What looks like ground roast coffee, sounds like ground roast coffee, smells like ground roast coffee, and tastes like ground roast coffee.
Ground roast coffee, right?
Wrong. Introducing the Fooler, Taster's Choice, the freeze-dried coffee. Good enough to fool you.
Are you sure this isn't ground roast coffee?
Taster's Choice, the new freeze-dried coffee from Nestle. It's got everything ground roast coffee has, except the grounds.
You cut yourself like that before the big dive, tomorrow you'll draw sharks.
Sharks?
Use Edge Protective Shave.
I use this.
Call that protective? Edge is a gel. This gel lubricates better than that foam.
You get a smooth shave?
Yeah, and I hardly cut myself anymore. It's that lubrication, I guess.
No nicks and no cuts.
And no sharks.
Edge Protective Shave.
Mary Jones is giving a party tonight. So at 2 in the afternoon, she's about to shampoo the rug. Crazy idea? Not with Glory Rug Cleaner. Just touch the button and Glory sprays foam like professionals use. Sponge it in with a wet sponge mop. It dries fast, usually in 2 to 4 hours. Then vacuum. It's so fast, you can clean your rug this afternoon, entertain guests tonight. Glory from Johnson Wax.
In the first scattered returns from the Senate race in Ohio, Democratic candidate Howard Metzenbaum jumped into a very early lead, but now with 2% of the votes counted in Ohio, we see on our board that Robert Taft, the Republican candidate, son of the longtime senator, Mr. Republican of Ohio, has taken the lead with 39,000 to 34,000 votes, as you see there. However, according to our scattered sample precincts and vote profile analysis, it is far too early to find any trend actually in Ohio in those early returns. It also is rather early, of course, out in the West Coast and in the western states generally, where many of the polls haven't closed yet. But Bill Stout can tell us what's going to happen out there perhaps later this evening. I'm sure his crystal ball is as clear as it always has been.
I wish I could, Walter. There are 10 Senate races in the West, and in 5 of those states, the president has campaigned. This is part of his effort, you've mentioned, to reshape the Senate. He did in California, where George Murphy, the incumbent Republican, is in trouble. He's trailed in the polls to Congressman John Tunney, the Democrat. The president went also to Utah, where Senator Frank Moss seems to have recovered from earlier trailings and is now given the edge over Congressman Lawrence Burton. Congressman Burton, incidentally, is another of those young Republicans the president persuaded to give up a seat in the House and try for the Senate. In Nevada, it's incumbent Howard Cannon trying for a 3rd term against William Raggio, the district attorney of Washoe County in Reno. In Arizona, Senator Paul Fannin is facing Sam Grossman, a young Democratic challenger. That looked close for a long time. It looked as though Grossman might take it, but the recent polls show Fannin moving back to the top. And in New Mexico, the 5th of the 10 Senate races the president has taken a hand in. Senator Joseph Montoya facing Republican Anderson Carter. There also, of course, is the big race for governor in California, where Ronald Reagan is given a large lead over Jess Unruh, the Democrat. But there's been a very heavy voter turnout today, and no one at this point can say exactly what that may mean. Very heavy throughout California and all the other areas we've heard from. Incidentally, Walter, I checked with the Churchill Downs Race and Sports Book in Las Vegas this evening. Their line is 20-1 on Ronald Reagan, 8-5 on John Tunney, 2-1 for Buckley over Ottinger in New York, and 6 or 7-1 in favor of Senator Cannon in their own Nevada. It's legal there, so I guess we can talk about that kind of thing.
I suppose we can. The thing about the California race that I believe is puzzling so many people and puzzles me, 20-1 for Reagan over Unruh. But wouldn't that indicate a sizable enough vote for him to carry Murphy along with him? Why then 7-5 on Tunney, or 8-5?
8-5 for Tunney. I really don't believe that the coattail business you talk about so much in the East and in some of the older states of the Midwest has that kind of effect in California. It has very rarely in the past, and there's no reason to think that it should be that important this time. The polls certainly haven't indicated it. While Governor Reagan has been 12, 15, 16 points ahead, Senator Murphy has been 6 and 8 behind.
That's just one of the races, of course, in California that we're going to be watching, of these 10 Senate races that are so close they're pretty hard to call. In the gubernatorial race in Georgia, with 24 out of our 70 selected precincts reporting, CBS News estimates that the Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter has won the governorship of Georgia over Republican Hal Suit. A gubernatorial call in Georgia, the Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter, as expected, over Republican Hal Suit. And now on the issues and their impact on this off-year election, here's David Shoemaker at our congressional desk. David?
Walter, so far on the basis of earlier returns, I'd have to say that my worst nightmares of the past week have been confirmed. The trends are there, all right. All of the trends are there, and they're canceling each other out. We've got statistics and polls at this desk on just about everything. We've questioned more than 900 candidates this year. We've also questioned voters in depth on their attitude. Some of their answers are obvious, others are not so obvious, and in fact are surprising. For instance, Democrats are more liberal than Republicans. That's right, isn't it? Women want to end the war more quickly than men. No, that's not right. Republican candidates are tougher than Democrats on crime. That's right. And the voters do think that the Republicans can handle the crime problem better than the Democrats. Not according to our polls. Well, anyway, one big issue that no one was really able to get a handle on this year was the marijuana problem. And so we did ask in a CBS News public opinion poll what the voters thought of the marijuana problem. We asked whether they thought that the penalty for selling marijuana should be made more lenient or more severe. 5% of the voters answered that they thought that the penalties should be eased. 7% said they thought the penalties should be kept about the same as they are. On the other hand, 86% said the laws for the sale of marijuana should be made more severe. It's kind of interesting when you consider that congressmen, both parties' congressmen, have been easing the penalties. One of the things we've discovered in our polling, by the way, is that politicians sometimes ignore the voters and what they want. Sometimes they really do what they think is best. And despite what the editorial writers say, it's not those old fogies in Congress who are against change. According to our surveys, Congress is much more willing to experiment than the president, much more willing to experiment than the voters as a group. And incidentally, Walter, we checked more than 900 candidates for office, and there was a surprise in that, too, on the matter of Vietnam. We could find only 31 confirmed hawks. Out of more than 900 candidates, there are only 31 who still think there should be a military victory in Vietnam. And Vice President Agnew, please note, we checked the 12 candidates who've been in this business of broadcasting, and we found that the broadcasters who are running for office are more pro-administration than anti-administration. But for now, looking at the early returns, Walter, I'd say that Teddy White is entirely safe out there onto the end of the pier watching for a tidal wave. There are only ripples.
We are developing what we used to call in old days, election nights, a horse race in Ohio. We now know, of course, and we knew then, but we just didn't seem to be quite so aware of it. We didn't have the computers, that there aren't any horse races as the votes are counted. The horse race is over. All that there is in the nature of a horse race is counting the votes. Well, whatever you want to call it, it's pretty close in Ohio. And Ben Rather's the guy who can tell us about it.
Walter, as a matter of fact, if we want to use that metaphor, it's neck and neck around the first turn also in Indiana, and I'd like to go there first, if I may, because we have 15% of the vote actually in and counted in Indiana. Remember that little square up in the right-hand corner of your screen, 15% of the vote in and tabulated. And look at it, Richard Roudebush, the Republican conservative congressman, out front of a liberal Democratic senator, the incumbent Vance Hartke, fighting to stay alive. It looks like it's just going to be about that close all evening long. Most of the votes thus far are from Marion County, the Indianapolis area, and we're told by our good friends Bob Gore and Lee Giles at Wish TV in Indianapolis that Roudebush in the Indianapolis area is running about 1.5 to 1 still over Hartke. And Roudebush's people felt they had to come out of Marion County, the biggest metropolitan area in Indiana, with about 2 to 1 in order to win the race. So again, that for the moment looks like our tightest race, unless Ohio is. First, the Ohio gubernatorial race. This is the governor's race featuring John Gilligan, the liberal Democrat, and Roger Cloud, the Republican. 3% of the vote actually in and tabulated. Gilligan, as expected, with a lead over Cloud, but on the basis of our voter profile analysis, We have some precincts in, but it still looks too close to call. Now, look at the Ohio senatorial race. This is the race in which Gilligan's long lead, it was hoped by Democrats, would coattail into office Howard Metzenbaum. And as we talk, the figures change. With 3% of the Ohio vote in and counted, Metzenbaum has taken the lead. This is seesawed back and forth, still very early now. Metzenbaum over Taft, but Metzenbaum's margin is much smaller than the margin Gilligan has over Cloud. And it's going to be just a question of whether Gilligan's lead in Ohio stands up and is wide enough in the governor's race to bring Metzenbaum, the Democrat surprise upset hope for the Senate race, along with him. Also, we'd like to point out that there's one possible upset in the making in a congressional race in our area, Walter, but at the moment it's in the Indiana congressional race. Yes, an upset possibly in the making. The 2nd Congressional District, Democrat Philip Sprague leading extreme conservative Republican incumbent Earl Langgrave. This seat once held by House Republican leader Charlie Halleck. That could be an upset in the making in a House race in Indiana. The Democrats surprisingly leading there. Walter?
We'll have more 1970 election results in a moment.
Oh, Mr. Benny, Mr. Benny.
Oh, hello, Dennis.
Hello, Mr. Benny. I was passing by and I thought I'd tell you.
Listen, I deposited that money for you in a savings and loan, Dennis.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Benny. I was passing by and I thought I'd better
See, where you save does make a difference, right?